please make welcome Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Good evening, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Sam, for that warm introduction. Thank you, John, for all of your leadership. And to Nick, now I know what it means to walk in the footsteps of the Lord, the Deputy Lord, the Deputy Lord Mayor, and I'm very impressed. And I do want to sell a book here. This is a remarkable accomplishment of the City of Melbourne. The voluntary local review of the city according to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's really a fantastic contribution for the world and very inspiring for cities around the world. So I really want to thank you for that. This really is a basic issue that we're facing with sustainable development. And the best way to understand it, ladies and gentlemen, is that when the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals was adopted in 2012, it was adopted in the context of a report issued at the time that the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had called for by commission. And the report was entitled "The Future We Want." And to me, that summarizes everything that we're trying to do. By that I mean we're trying to think. That's one of the hardest challenges. We're trying to think together about the future that we, the peoples of the world, want for the planet and for our local communities. And in that process of thinking about what we want, from 2012 to 2015, a quite remarkable process took place at the United Nations where essentially every government, all 193 member states of the UN, participated pretty actively in debating what is the future we want. And the idea was to set a number of objectives about that future, and they became known as the Sustainable Development Goals. And it was a very interesting process to watch because initially the governments were canvassed, what should our goals be? And the initial list had 300 goals, so you can feel relieved that in the process of 3 years, they whittled it down to only 17, albeit with 159 targets among those 17 goals. But I'm very impressed, actually, with how that complicated, bureaucratic committee of 193 actually discussed the issue of the future we want, because the starting point that was universally accepted was that the first goal was to end extreme deprivation on the planet. So SDG 1 is to end extreme poverty. And through the 17 goals, universal human aspirations were put in front of us and made into a kind of, I think, a tangible, even quantifiable set of objectives for humankind. And I spent those 3 years trying to get them down to 10 goals because I always invoked the Moses precedent. And I thought 2 tablets would be enough, but it was just Moses and God, after all, that got down to 10. This was 193 negotiating, and it came down to 17. that are really, really nice. They're really about the future that people anywhere aspire to end extreme deprivation, to end hunger, which has been a blight and a plague of humanity for as long as there has been humanity, to ensure universal health coverage, something that became dramatically tangible during the pandemic, to do something that should be so basic that it could have been done and should have been done a long time ago, but still is far from being done, and that's to ensure that every child has a place in school, which is SDG 4, to ensure that girls have the same opportunities as boys and women, the same opportunities as men in SDG 5, and a list that goes on to aim for 3 broad categories of objectives: economic well-being, social inclusion, like gender equality and reducing vast inequalities of income and wealth, which is SDG 10, and environmental sustainability, which includes all of the crises that we are facing: the loss of biodiversity, the destruction of our marine and terrestrial ecosystems, and of course the climate crisis. And these goals are capped off by 2 crucial goals, 16 and 17, which in one way are the most obvious, but maybe the hardest of all to achieve. SDG 16 is for peaceful societies. And we meet this evening with several wars raging in the world, and absolutely terrible times where these wars are extraordinarily cruel and destructive, and still by no means under any kind of control or self-limiting process. And SDG 17 is for partnerships generally, but mainly the recognition that to achieve anything in this world, we need cooperation. And that cooperation is at all scales. It's within our communities, it's within our cities, it's within our nations, it's with our neighboring countries, and it is also at a global scale. So that's a pretty good definition of the future we want, actually. And what I can tell you in my nearly nonstop circumnavigation of the world in discussions and pursuit of the SDGs, they resonate in all parts of the world. I literally did not arrive in a single country of the 100+ countries that I've visited in the last 8 years where I have been challenged by a senior government official or a leader of business or a leader of civil society with the notion that why are we after these goals? In fact, the governments almost everywhere, when they are functioning and thinking, are embracing these objectives and actually trying to achieve them. Now, it raises a fundamental puzzle. Is it possible, or is this just a nice set of ideas? And that is really our challenge. So let me give you an economic perspective on that question first, and then a social, geopolitical, and ethical perspective on that question. First, the economic question. Australia economically is pretty close to achieving sustainable development. Of course, you have a little tidying up to do. The coal has to go, and the solar power has to be brought in, and that is going to prove to be completely manageable. It's a big deal. It's a lot of effort. I don't mean to diminish it, but it's not an existential question for this country or a financial make or break or something that is going to create suffering in Australia. None of that. It's actually pretty straightforward, and your government in Victoria is well on its way to creating a power system that's based on renewable energy, and I have no doubt that if you invite me back, in 10 years we'll be celebrating essentially the full transformation of the electricity grid here, and that will already be powering much of the transport and the housing and the building sector and industry. So yes, there's work to be done, and we had better do it, because even though it's utterly achievable, not even that costly, if we don't do it, it'll be unbelievably destructive and costly, the consequences that we will face. So I would say Australia's pretty close to achieving the SDGs. There's not really extreme poverty, though there is relative poverty, of course. There's not really hunger, though there is food insecurity at times, to be sure. There is essentially universal health coverage, though I'm sure with some practical exceptions. Life expectancy is 83 years. That's absolutely wonderful. And by the way, 7 years longer than the United States right now, just to give you a sense of how messed up my own country is. But don't get me started, because it'll be a long evening. So there's cleaning up to do, which is really important, but I'm going to stipulate that Australia can make it, and if you continue to have really intelligent deputy Lord Mayors and government officials and task forces and MSDIs and Monash and sector policies and all the smart things that the government is doing right now, you'll make it. The question for me is not really the question of Australia, but the question, can the world do that? And even a simple question, can the world live like Melbourne, prospectively? Is that feasible? Or is that crazy? You might say, and I'll put it in the following terms, roughly speaking, the average income in the world, roughly, is around $12,000. And the average income in Australia is roughly 4.5 times that. So you could ask, could the world do 4 times more income without destroying the planet or blowing up the ecosystem or running out of resources or finding other physical constraints because we're a finite planet? So is it impossible to imagine that poor places in the world would converge to live at 83 years and have the comforts and the beauty of Collins Street and the chances for leisure that you have and for great universities and great culture and so forth? And my answer as an economist is, yeah, that is actually quite possible. It's not that, my God, we had better cut the living standards in Australia by half or 2/3 to make room so that the rest of the world isn't left at the edge of poverty. Economics is not a zero-sum struggle. And the biggest mistake in history is to believe that it is, actually. Because if you believe that it is, people kill other people to make sure that they're the ones that have the supposed limited resources. And they believe that there's a struggle for survival, and so it's us and them. And that mentality literally played a major role in the wars of the last 2 centuries. And it's completely wrong. Why does Australia live with the living standards that it does? The most fundamental reason is that all of you in this room have had a good education. You've all gone to school, many of you to advanced degrees. That's a lot of social organization, but that is not necessarily limited by any means. We really could educate every child in this world. In fact, with the tools that we have with online learning and having a $50 or $100 device on hand to ensure access to digital learning as well as in-person learning, it's not even a hard thing to imagine, and certainly not very expensive. So the main reason that Australians live well is that you have lots of skills, lots of knowledge, lots of technical capacity. And because of that, and over the course of generations to accumulate and acquire that and to transmit that to your children and grandchildren, of course, the infrastructure of this country has been built. The electrification, the tram out front, the water systems, and so forth. So one could ask the question, well, could all of that kind of infrastructure be developed in the course of 1 or 2 generations, even in poor places? The answer, interestingly, is yeah, even that is rather affordable. Generally, public infrastructure is maybe 5 or 10% of the national income devoted for those investments. And in a rich world, even the poor countries could access the capital that they need to have electricity for all, especially with low-cost solar power now available, digital access, which is already reaching most of the world, and so forth. So the infrastructure and the human capital can really reach the world without any evident limit. And it used to be felt, well, we'll run out of oil and gas and coal. The truth, as you know, is we've got to keep what we have under the ground, and we will not run out of sunshine, actually. Nor will we run out of the land to provide the sunshine. Because, as I'm sure many of you have seen, even a small square in the Sahara Desert captures enough insulation to provide all the power that's needed in the whole world if there were transmission lines that were adequate to carry that. The insolation or solar radiation is about 5,000 times our energy use. So we're not going to run out of sunshine. We're not limited by thermodynamics. We're not even practically limited by our energy supplies. We're not limited by the bits and bytes that can be transmitted on fiber. We're not limited in the ability of people to get a decent education. In fact, in many ways, as I've emphasized, it's become even more evident how this can be done. And we have an example, your neighbor to the north in the Asia Pacific, China, a country of 1.4 billion people that in 40 years went from poverty to high income status. It's just breaking through the threshold of the World Bank's high income category right now. But there's no extreme poverty in China. But 45 years ago, it was pervasive poverty, and without the infrastructure, and without the business development. And so in a matter of 2 generations, China raised life expectancy remarkably, raised education levels phenomenally, raised income levels and security phenomenally, went from what had been also with policy disasters, but because of poverty, what had been a brink of hunger that led to mass famine, of course, during the Great Leap Forward at the end of the 1950s and early 1960s, to a country that is absolutely economically thriving and will continue to increase living standards. India is doing something similar right now. Africa, which is also 1.4 billion people, just like India and China, has had a much harder time in the world, partly because the imperial powers divided the continent into 55 countries, which made essentially every one too small for development. And by the time the Europeans left Africa, they also left a continent that was completely bereft of even basic education, because the European imperialism in Africa was absolutely cruel and uncivilized, and in many places left a country with 5 people with a high school education. So the starting point was very, very difficult, and the continued exploitation by Europe and by others after, and by the United States and others afterwards, remained strong. So Africa is sometimes looked at as not capable of this, but I would tell you as a prediction that from today to 2063, 40 years, which is the 100th birthday of the African Union in 2063, Africa too could achieve what China has achieved during the past 40 years. In other words, 2 generations of very rapid progress. So my answer as an economist is I've looked long and hard at the question of whether we are bound by physical limits at this stage, thermodynamic limits, or many of you probably know the human footprint, which says we're already 1.5 planets Earth, so we're already consuming more than 1.5 planets. This is just wrong, by the way. What it's right about is saying that we are unsustainable right now, but the way that that calculation is made, that you sometimes hear that we're already living 1.5 Earths or 2.5 Earths, is that what the authors are doing is something a little funny. They're saying because of the CO2 emissions that are unsustainable, we could think about offsetting them in hectarage terms by the amount of hectares that would need to be filled with forests to offset the CO2 emissions. And if you make that calculation, you need a world of forests to offset the 40 billion tons of CO2 being emitted by fossil fuels. And then they say, well, we're already living 1.5 planets. It's good for a headline, but it's actually not the way we're going to stop the climate crisis. We're not going to plant an Earth of forests each year and continue emitting 40 gigatons of CO2 emissions. We're going to stop the CO2 emissions Of course, we should actually afforest also, but not many planets worth, several tens of millions of hectares worth for sure in different parts of the world. But the idea that we're physically unable to achieve sustainable development is absolutely wrong. So, good news. Now I'm going to end the good news and turn to reality. Are we doing what we could be doing? And the answer is no. And why? Well, I'll give you one example that really annoys me, and that is that probably 400 million kids at school age are not in school right now. Are you kidding? Would you stand for your child 1 week not being in school, much less no prospect of being in school? And yet it's hundreds of millions of kids. And the reason is not mainly self-evident, unfortunately, but the main reason is poverty, because running a school system costs something. And when you're very poor as a society, neither the government nor the households can afford to have all the kids in school. But we could afford to have all the kids in school, even the kids in the poor places. Because when you do the arithmetic, maybe it's an extra $50 billion needed, or maybe an extra $100 billion needed. But remember that the rich world, that's Australia and Japan and Korea and the European Union and UK and United States and Canada, that's it. That world has about $60 trillion of output. So 60 billion is 0.1% of our income. And that would be enough to get all the kids in school. So even that's not a constraint, but we're not doing it. Because when's the last time Joe Biden scratched his head and said, why aren't all those kids in school and what can the United States do about it? That would be never, because they don't think in those terms. Because Joe Biden thinks, when he does, that how am I going to get reelected next year? And I don't want someone yelling at me for giving away our money, except if it's for a war, because he thinks he can sell the war. But other than that, he doesn't want to give away money to poor people. And so our problems are basically of three varieties, and I'll stop here because we're going to have a discussion about this with Sam Most in just a moment. One set of issues is the agenda's complicated. We need to change how we do certain things. When you analyze what we need to change, for example, our energy system from coal, oil, and gas to wind, solar, hydro, maybe nuclear, and so on, well, you better have a good engineering friend alongside to explain certain things to you, but they will tell you, yeah, that could be done. And actually, as an economist, I could say it's not even that expensive, although if you're a coal owner, you won't love it necessarily. But that's absolutely doable. Now, if you take all these goals together, you get a book like this. And it's pretty complicated. And as the Deputy Lord Mayor said to me earlier, you know, it's one thing to have a general set of objectives, but when you're out on the street and you're trying to implement this, it's pretty complicated. So we need new kinds of governance for this, that's for sure. It's like going back to school, or reinventing school, actually, and reinventing how we do things. And that is one major issue. Complexity. A second major issue is vested interests. You know, in principle, the winners could compensate the losers just about for everything, because if you're making a better society, in principle, everyone could gain, but in practice, probably the oil industry is not going to love this, because we're going to use less oil. And the coal sector's really going to shut down, basically, and so forth. And so those interests can be quite powerful, as you know, in this country. And in the United States, our chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Joe Manchin, senator of West Virginia, owns 2 coal companies. And he just doesn't love this agenda, and basically has blocked anything in this agenda, and that's a measure of the corruption of American politics. It's pretty rotten, actually. It's designed to protect wealth, and increasingly just the wealth of the congressmen themselves, who are quite wealthy, but especially the wealth of the campaign contributors who pay the bills for the re-election of our Congress and president. And about $15 billion will change hands in the US in the next year during this election campaign. And even when you ask, well, is that candidate viable? The newspapers report, yes, look at how many millions he's raised or she's raised. How weird is that, by the way? But that's actually our standard, because we're so twisted in our minds, we think if you're raising a lot of money, that proves you're a good candidate. Whereas it's just the opposite. It proves you have probably sold your soul 10 times and will be hopeless as a political leader, actually, which is unfortunately what most of ours are. So that's the second problem, is the vested interests. And the third problem is basically SDG 17, and that is solidarity. That is getting along. That's also about your vote this weekend and how hard it is to think about others and to cooperate with others. I think it's pretty cool that we're on the land of the Wurundjeri, I understand, if I had that right, and that is 2,000 generations. My God, and you greeted us, Deputy Lord Mayor, in their voice from time immemorial. And that is absolutely wondrous, and it should be the most cherished thing imaginable for us. And we can't quite get that right. And I don't understand it. We do not say in the United States, when we start any speech, we recognize that we are on the hallowed grounds of the people of so-and-so. They were long exterminated, and we don't even mention it. Never discussed. So this is the cruelty, actually, of our world and our great difficulty as human beings in doing the one thing that we really need to do, and that is to get along, and get along in an ethical way, and now, harder than ever, get along in a global reach. And maybe it's what I have learned in 43 years of my activity and 51 years of studying economics, with an incredibly lucky gift to be able to see most of the world, is we really could get along, because people really do want the same future. They really do want peace. Every time we hear they're evil and so forth, that's wrong. And it is completely the wrong way for us to create the future that we want. The war in Ukraine never should have happened. It was provoked by the United States pushing NATO up to Russia's borders. This disaster in Israel is after 56 years of profound Israeli failure to address the real conditions of the Palestinian people whose lands they occupy, and have never honestly tried to face this crisis. It's really us versus them mentality. The belief that you gotta keep the rest of the world poor because otherwise that will take away from us is a very deeply held belief. It was the literal belief of German thinkers before Nazism came to power, and it informed the Nazi idea that Germany needed living room to the east because otherwise the German nation couldn't survive, so it was a struggle for survival of us versus them. So these ideas and this instinct of, or this capacity of hate is our deadliest barrier to building the future that we want. And I'll end with a semi-hopeful note. 10 years ago, I wrote a book on the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's initiative to try to make peace with the Soviet Union. And that followed the Cuban Missile Crisis, which nearly brought us to global nuclear annihilation. And in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, both Kennedy and Khrushchev realized we need to find a way to peace. And they were both, in their way, magnificent people who had nearly stumbled to nuclear war that neither of them in any conceivable sense wanted, and by the way, which their advisors on both sides urged, because the instinct, well, drop the bombs, is very strong, and people are trained for that, but they're not necessarily trained for peace. So 60 years ago, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy made a campaign for peace. And he gave a speech in June 10, 1963, which I regard as the most magnificent speech by an American president in modern history. And I would urge people to listen to it because it's dazzling in its wisdom and its eloquence, and it became known as his peace speech. And Khrushchev heard it, and 5 weeks later they negotiated the partial nuclear test ban treaty because they had found a bridge. And Kennedy was very worried that the US people would not accept making peace with the Soviet Union because that was the hated other, the hated foe. So President Kennedy went on a peace campaign throughout the American states. And just 60 years ago, just now, the Senate ratified the partial nuclear test ban treaty by an overwhelming, decisive majority. And Kennedy said, and I want to close with this, words that I think define the future we want and the future we can build because of the common humanity. He said, "So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal." Thank you very much.
You might like a glass of water, Jeff, after all of that. What a remarkable speech. No notes just no notes at all, just Professor Sachs sharing with us, as I said to you, that immense wisdom, but bringing us into a way that I think there wasn't a moment where we weren't all completely hanging on your words, Jeff. And you could have spoken for a lot longer, but we decided that we would have a conversation. So I thought I'd start. I said in the introductory remarks that you and I were sitting on a panel just across the road at the Town Hall in May 2014, so that predates the promulgation of the SDGs in 2015. That was during that 2012-2015 time you spoke about. And we had a wonderful conversation about going into the SDGs and the work that you'd seen about what had changed and your great hope about what that phrasing of what's the future we want was going to deliver. Can you start by, I guess, reflecting on the country you're visiting a decade later, and perhaps the things to build on some of the things you said in your speech, where the big challenges are in those SDGs as we sit here today with 2030 as the targeted endpoint of the SDGs. We're getting close to that. What that means for us and what it might mean for us in Australia.
Great. Yeah, that was a very nice event 9 years ago, and we were on the verge of adopting sustainable development. So if you think about those 9 years in the context of our challenge of building the future we want, soon after we spoke, the world adopted two major goals. First, the Agenda 2030 with the 17 SDGs, and second, the Paris Agreement. So the first thing that happened was quite positive, which is that on two occasions within an 8-week period, the 193 UN member states agreed on a framework. And that is still our framework, both the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Once they were agreed, very small progress was achieved. And one thing that is extremely important to understand is that first, obviously, not one thing, a couple things. The goals are not self-implementing. They require lots of action. They require investments. They require governments that have the intention and the capacity to produce studies like this. So governments started to try to adopt the goals, try to understand them, but there was no breakthrough in any major area, especially the money for the poorer countries. So nothing happened on the financing for a number of years. Then came COVID and the pandemic. I won't give my lecture about why that was probably created in a US laboratory, but I'll leave it at that. But it probably was, just to tell you. Yeah. Surprising, but true.
We could take this conversation in all sorts of
Exactly.
new directions.
We'll go someplace else. And then came war in Ukraine, and now war in Israel and Palestine. And now we're way off track. We're not going to achieve the SDGs by 2030. I could have given that punchline in most of the places for most of the goals. It doesn't mean that's not the future we want, and it doesn't mean it's not the future that we can achieve. It is the future we want, and it is the future we can achieve, but we're not going to do it on schedule because we're not trying very hard, and we have failed in the global cooperation. We're still failing, but I'm not giving up because as miserable as the politics are right now, it doesn't work for anybody the way things are going. And so we are going to recognize later or sooner that we need a different track and a different path. When President Biden came in, he said, the world's great challenge is the struggle between democracies and autocracies. And I said, oh God, no. Come on. You start by dividing the world. Completely wrong, by the way. Again, I can go on at length, and I won't, but don't start by dividing the world, especially if you're the richest country in the world. Start by saying, what can we do to help the world achieve the future that we want? So in 2023, we're way off track. And we're going to stay off track for a while. And we need on many specifics and in general approach, or in general issues, we need a different approach. The overarching thing that we need is leaders saying we really need to work together to get to where we want to go together. We need to tone down the us versus them dramatically. We don't need AUKUS. We don't need nuclear submarines here. We don't. You don't. It's an incredible waste of money. It's, by the way, it's a scam, I'm telling you. It is a US scam. They want to sell you stuff, and you're buying right now for some reason. But you're really smart people, so you're going to figure that out, that this is absolutely scam. The last thing you need in your house is an extra submarine, right? We really need a different direction. And next year is a very interesting, could be a really interesting meeting, and I think we should try to make it as interesting as possible. The UN is, Secretary General Guterres has called for a summit of the future, and that will be in September 2024. And the basic reason that he called for it is that he knows that the current framework isn't working anymore. And without putting exact words in his mouth, the current international system is the 1945 system, both in its brilliant side, creating the UN, and its not so brilliant side of these continuing wars. But it was a US created system. And we're now entering the true multipolar world, not the US-led world, but the true multipolar world, in which China gets a big voice, and India gets a big voice, and Russia gets a big voice, and each part of the world is going to have a big voice. And I like that world a lot better than a leader, which I think is a misguided idea in any event. But Secretary General Guterres knows we need a new framework of multilateralism, basically. We need an appreciation of a true multipolar world operating under international rule of law, what the US and Australia and others call the rule-based system is the US rules-based system, which nobody wants anymore outside of our narrow corner of the world. What they want is truly an international rule-based system under UN auspices, and we can really help to shape that. And next year, I think, can be an extremely interesting time for that. So 9 years on, the best things are we have clear goals that we did not have 9 years ago. They are globally agreed. We have vastly better technology than we had even 9 years ago. So 9 years ago, the idea of full decarbonization was not viewed as practical by almost everybody. Now it's actually viewed not only as practical, but almost at grid parity with a fossil fuel-based system. So we have vastly better tools, agreed global goals, and I think our major challenge is working together. It's not the shortage of resources, the shortage of the what to do, the how to do, but rather it's the shortage of the institutions and even the ethics of doing it together.
Thank you. Can I stick with your comments about the UN just
Yes.
for a moment? Because it seems to me that the current Secretary-General has stepped into that space of leadership where he's calling everything as he sees it. There's no mincing the words. He's recently talked about us going from global warming to global boiling. He has put on the table for the members of the United Nations a clear sense that he expects more of the member states. And what you've just described with his Summit of the Future next year and your confidence in it, I guess in Australia, as with many parts of the Western world, we've become more divided about the issues of do we trust these international bodies or do we have primacy of nation states? And we've seen many of those nation states ignore the UN. How does the UN, in your mind, play that role? Is it someone like Guterres who has to just be out front, calling it and being that, I guess, that beacon that will bring nation states together and do that cooperation? Is that, because for many there would be a sense that UN is a lumbering, slow organisation where all they hear about is that the Security Council can't fix the major wars that we're dealing with. How do you describe the UN to cynics and people, given that it's one of the places where we can talk about the future?
First, we need to think about what the UN really is. The UN is, first, the meeting place of 193 governments, national governments. So that's the UN General Assembly. The UN is, secondly, the UN Security Council, which is the part of our international legal structure assigned with the unique responsibilities for war and peace, though obviously not effective right now. Then the UN is a secretariat. That's the building that you see in New York with 38 floors, where the Secretary General and a staff work, and that is a professional bureau that works to facilitate the interactions of 193 governments. Then the UN is a number of specialized agencies like WHO, UNIDO, UNESCO, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, which are our unique international organizations for looking at global technical issues, sometimes even standard setting like the International Telecommunications Union or WHO for that matter. But in all of this, there is a pervasive role of the nation state as the organizing principle. We are organized on nation state grounds in international affairs. This is unfortunate in a lot of ways because our problems are not well defined at the national level. They are generally better defined at the regional level, meaning, for example, Australia plus ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, or they're defined at the global level, for example, on climate. But we don't have global government, and we don't really have regional government. We have national governments that protect their prerogatives and that have the tax power and the finance power and don't much give it up, actually. So we are short of cash for almost everything that we need at the global level because our politicians are elected nationally. They think nationally. They try to win office nationally. They think that it's America first or Australia first or some other place first. And it's a wrong level of organization. So you could imagine, for example, rather than a UN General Assembly, which is 193 national governments, a world parliament. You could really imagine that next door to the UNGA would be a parliament of the peoples rather than an assembly of national governments. We'll come to that, by the way, in the 21st century, because the nation state it's not outmoded, but has no special claim to priority the way we think it does. And the UN is crippled by being an organization of nation states only. It has no tax power. It has no ability to raise revenues. It has no ability to direct resources to goals that are set. It has no ability to write global regulations or laws other than what national governments do. And I think what we will have instead, and we were speaking with the Deputy Lord Mayor, I love that title. We don't have lords in the U.S., so it's great. We were talking about a concept of subsidiarity, which is thinking of governance in concentric circles. You try to solve the problem at the level of government closest to the people as appropriate. So the tram should really be managed by Melbourne, not by the UN. That's clear. But Melbourne can't manage the global climate crisis. That's really a global management issue. Melbourne can't manage the global poverty issue, which requires resources to flow from rich to poor countries to resolve that. A nation, Brazil, can't manage the Amazon because there are 9 countries that share the Amazon, and the Mekong requires watershed management by China, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, and Vietnam. No one can manage that. The Nile needs cooperation of Sudan, Ethiopia, Egypt, and so on. So the idea of subsidiarity is we need government at all levels, not just governance. We need a world government. It doesn't do everything. It does the things that the world has to do at a world level. We need a regional government. You have made, and you are part of something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which is a trade agreement right now, just getting started. And it brings together Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea, 10 ASEAN countries, Australia, and New Zealand. That's actually the right level of aggregation for the energy transformation, because Australia should be providing a lot of hydrogen and green electrons to Southeast Asia, for example. And that means government at a regional level for certain tasks. So in subsidiarity, it's like the Matryoshka dolls, the Russian dolls, inside, 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 down to the household, the neighborhood, the community, the city, the metropolitan area, the state of Victoria, Australia, RCEP, global. And we don't have that right now. And that's why we're flailing along, because we have national governments. And national governments, sometimes they're pretty good, sometimes they're absolutely awful. I will, again, offer my country as Exhibit A. This is our institutional challenge, and next year, I hope some of this is actually discussed at the UN.
We could talk for a lot of topics, and we're going to fast run out of time. So
I'm
going to take you at a couple of points out of your remarks, and it builds on your last response. It seems to me, in leaving us with that marvellous quote from JFK in 1963, and your earlier remarks about where there are limits. And I heard you talk about there not being any limits on some sunshine or land or education, but it feels like there are limits to the human capacity to think about the future and think about others in a system that has become so polarised, where we think about ourselves or our nation or winning an election. So my question is 2 parts, Jeff, and we'll need to get through it quite quickly, though. One is, who are the leaders that you're seeing emerging? I know you've got some favourite leaders around the world who've got that capacity to step up and think for others, bring others to think in that more global and in the future. And what do you say back to Australia? You started just then talking about us in this region, and I know you've got a view about us in the region. And I think the AUKUS comment links to how much we still link our future to the UK-US. And yet we live in a part of the world where our geographic future is here, and you pointed to that. So I guess the people that you see that could inspire us, but some reminders to us about the region we're in and the role that Australia can and should be playing as we solve these crises in a cooperative way.
Leaders come in many directions, and for reasons that I've just explained, national political leaders are one of many categories that one might look to, and there aren't so many national political leaders that I think are playing that role. My go-to guy right now for some guidance is Pope Francis, and as a Jewish kid from Detroit, it's a little unusual, but just to say that, you know, Pope Francis's idea is actually one, humanity facing the real human needs of the planet. It's what Kennedy aspired to in 1963. Arguably, he was killed because of that vision, by the way, because there were rogue elements in the US government that absolutely hated his peace agenda. And that's part of the challenge of making peace, which is that it's easier to kill a peacekeeper, a peacemaker, than it is to stop a war. And peacemakers keep getting killed, unfortunately, by those who don't want peace to be made.
Nice
so
to see
Pope
the
Francis has issued 2 encyclicals which reflect a long, deep tradition of Catholic social teachings. Again, I was not raised in that tradition, but those social teachings go back to my go-to philosopher, who's Aristotle, and I think he wrote the best book ever written on ethics in the year 230 BC, around that time, and the best book on politics ever written, and they were written conjointly, Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics. And the Church uses Aristotle through the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas brought up to the modern age. So without going into this, that's a moral leader. And Pope Francis speaks magnificently to political leaders. And he tells them, think, stop. You don't need the war. He was the one that said many years ago, we're already in World War III. He may be profoundly right, awful as it is to contemplate that. And there are many leaders around the world who inspire and want to do the right thing, and it's our individual job to do the best we can in doing what we have within our own capacities and our own responsibilities for this. And there's no shortage of goodwill. There's not even a shortage of good sense in the world. If the American government did what a majority of Americans want, we'd have completely different politics, because they would raise taxes on the rich, they would make the corporations pay more, they would have universal health coverage, they would act on climate change, and they would stop the wars. There's a large majority in favor of all of those things in the United States, but our political system is corrupted, as I said. So we need to speak out in our capacities. What I love about the Sustainable Development Goals is it gives us a language to speak, and it gives us a common language. And I can go anywhere in the world and talk to any government, and actually almost all of them know what I'm talking about when I say SDG 3. Yes, Professor Sachs, here's our plan for SDG 3, and that's very positive. And I'll quote President Kennedy, same speech, same idea. He was saying, we need to set a goal for peace, a practical goal, and for him, in 1963, that was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And he said something very wise about leadership. He said, by defining our goal more clearly, By making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So this is a lesson in leadership. Define the goal more clearly, make it seem more manageable and less remote, and people will see it, they will draw hope from it, and as he says, they will move irresistibly toward it. And you know, one of the goals that President Kennedy set in addition to peace was going to the moon. And he defined it clearly, and the whole country rose up and said, that's cool, let's do that. That was my childhood. Listening and watching every moonshot from Mercury, Gemini, Apollo mission to the completion of the mission within the decade that Kennedy said. So we need to make this fun too, inspiring, exciting, but especially help people to see what we're trying to do. And that can be leaders in business, it can be leaders in politics, it can be leaders in the Catholic Church or other religious leaders, and I'm very fond of the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, who is a great environmentalist. And the world will resonate to this. Our national leaders will probably come along later rather than leading. This is actually reality. And academics, especially if you have tenure, go lead, because you are privileged. Presumably they can't fire you. I'm testing that every day. But I think we should use our privilege to try to say clearly the things that need to be done. And that, to my mind, is where we as academics fit in.
Not a question, but just, I guess, a reflection. I'm sorry, I almost interrupted you before. It was nice to see that the Nobel Prize for Economics only this week went to Professor Claudia Golden from Harvard.
Absolutely.
And all the work that she's done on women in the labour market.
Exactly.
And lovely to see a woman winning a Nobel Prize for Economics.
A longtime friend and an outstanding economist.
So it's good to see that new people, women particularly, are getting that acknowledgement. But also Najeh Mohammadi, who won the Peace Prize this year. Of course, she's in jail in Iran as a protester. And as you were talking about the fact that we can remove peacekeepers rather than stop wars. And I was just reflecting on the fact that Najeh is in prison at the moment, receiving that Peace Prize. Would you mind just very briefly giving us this regional story for Australia? Because I just think, hearing you this morning talk about how we've got to get focused on how we can lead into the region and how important that is, I guess for our audience, just to take some hope that we can play a very significant role. You said at the beginning of your remarks that we're doing quite well in the SDGs, that we've got good governments at all levels now that I think are really pressing, not just on SDGs, but on all the activities around climate itself. But we've not been great in really engaging with our region. We've lost a connection of languages with the region. Our young people don't learn languages of the region. And as you say, AUKUS has taken us back into a series of partnerships. Yep. Your advice to us about why the region matters. And I think, and you can't do it all in a couple of minutes, but China, you have a very interesting view on China, which again would challenge many people's view of this contest that's been set up, that China needs to be stopped and thwarted and is a bad actor. And your view is quite different at the moment, Jeff.
So let me start. We're all family. We're all part of the Anglo-Saxon world, and we speak English, and we are all inheritors of Britain. We in the United States, and you here in Australia and New Zealand and Canada, with some interesting differences, but basically we all live in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's a very interesting story, which is another 10 hours of discussion. A very weird world. In many ways, it made major contributions to the world, obviously, especially in science and technology and creating the industrial world. Unique contributions from Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, the Royal Society, James Watt, and so forth. And that made the modern world because Britain really invented the industrial age. And but it created two strange things. One was it created hegemony. The British Empire ruled the world in the 19th century to a large extent and just beat the crap out of everybody. Britain was more violent than any other country in the world in the 19th century. Went to war everywhere, often profoundly cynical wars like the Opium Wars, which are on my list of wars among my most detested wars. How can you go to war with a country to take your opium, for God's sake? And Britain did it twice. And the United States inherited that idea, and the US has been at war most of its history. It had to defeat and in many cases exterminate the native populations. So we don't even, as I said, recognize what we have done. And then when the North American continent was finished, we went out to create an empire, and then when the British Empire fell, the American Empire replaced it in 1945. So the Anglo-Saxon world's a little bit strange because it's run the world for 2 centuries. The rest of the world's quite tired of that, by the way. Really tired of it. I see it every day in my professional life for the last 40 years. They do not want to be told what to do by the United States. But the US cannot hear that at all. They think, oh, you want us to lead? Okay, we'll lead. No, don't lead. Oh, you want us to lead? We'll lead. And that's the endless discussion. So be careful in Australia because it's a little strange, our heritage. The second thing that's strange, you don't have it as bad as we do. We got the laissez-faire bug to the maximum in the US. So we are truly heirs of John Locke. And Adam Smith was a very nice person, but also he basically said, let things run, they'll take care of themselves. And that view, Locke, little worse, which was the only legitimate government is a government that doesn't tax people, because the purpose of government is to protect their wealth. That's the American view. I am coming to understand that Australia is more influenced by Bentham than Locke, because you came later a little bit, and Bentham is a lot more civilized than Locke in this. But the Anglo-Saxon philosophy of the world, which is let her rip, is very convenient for rich and powerful people and not so convenient for poor and vulnerable people. And so I think we have a strange philosophy in the Anglo-Saxon world that we also need to reassess. Now, to come to Australia, you're part of the Anglo-Saxon world, and the US wants you really in that grip, but you're also actually in the Asia-Pacific, which is interesting. It's a great part of the world. It's the most dynamic part of the world. It's the fastest growing part of the world economy. It's an extremely successful part of the world. And you should enjoy that and really be part of it also. So I'm a fan of China and a fan of Chinese civilization. It's a little simplistic way to put it, but it's been around as a unified nation since 221 BC. Statecraft has been quite strong for 2,000 years, very strong today, very talented people. When I deal with Chinese leaders and bureaucrats and technocrats, they are among the most sophisticated people that I meet in the world. They know their brief. They're doing a very serious job. You don't achieve 10% growth per year for 40 years as a, slacking off. You do it because you're really running things extremely well. Now, if you think about all the times that China invaded Australia in history, you would come to 0 in 2,000 years. If you think about all the times that China invaded its neighbor Japan, you would possibly say 1274 and 1281 AD, but then you would say, but that was actually the Mongols, that wasn't the Chinese. Other than that, never. If you think about China's overseas empire in that 2,000 years, well, that would be never. So we should understand we're dealing with a great civilization that does not have a tradition of transoceanic empires. It doesn't have a network of 800 military bases around the world like the United States. It doesn't surround the United States with its military bases in the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and wherever else, in contrast to the United States wanting military bases every place up and down the South China Sea and around every border of China, and saying, why are you worried? So we should really engage with China. We should enjoy the wonders of one of the world's greatest cultures and civilizations, a breakthrough in economic development in the last 45 years. We should understand that China's whole lifeline depends on the South China Sea, so with the United States militarized up to the wazoo, maybe China has some security concerns that we should recognize and acknowledge. We shouldn't badmouth China for every good thing that it tries to do, including the Belt and Road Initiative, which is actually a wonderful initiative. The idea of the Belt and Road Initiative is that China will use its very high saving to help finance modern infrastructure. And Australia should say, that's great. We'll work together with you on that. We've got a lot of technology. We are going to provide a lot of clean energy. We can do all sorts of things. And ASEAN's your neighbor to the south. It's our neighbor to the north. We should be part of that. Well, the United States would blow a gasket. You know, Biden had to call the Prime Minister of Italy into the Oval Office to be dressed down. You've got to get out of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is US hegemonic thinking. So my real advice to you is work constructively in your neighborhood. Make partnerships, deepen relations. Monash has a campus in Suzhou, and that's fantastic. There's all sorts of wonderful things that can be done in this region. It's technologically extremely sophisticated, and it is, I think, the low-cost providers of the green industry and energy for the whole world. So it also gives you a nice vocation for the next 50 years of the next generation of Australia's growth. So in general, by the way, my philosophy is be nice to your neighbors, and they should be nice to you. And the more you talk with them, play bridge with them, play whatever you do, play cricket or rugby with them, teach the Chinese rugby,
footy.
You'll
It's
beat
footy
them. But have a good time and chill out, and don't have nuclear submarines. You don't need them.
Jeff, it's just ticked over 8 o'clock, so we're going to have to end our conversation to let people get on with their evenings as we promised. I think there were so many things we could reflect on. We could take this conversation much deeper. I'm sure many of you wished you'd been up here having this conversation. I was the very lucky person to be sitting here. You've asked us to get along better. You've asked us to be full of love instead of hate. You've reminded us that this is all about cooperation. You've told us not to think of the SDGs as just a nice set of ideas, but make it possible. You've asked us to think about our locuses of influence, the city, our households, all the way up to the world. You've taken us on the most extraordinary erudite education with economics, history, politics, and all of that in just an hour and a half with us this evening. It's an extraordinary thing that you do. I think you are one of those leaders that we yearn for and that we were trying to describe earlier, that is in the world, helping us all be better people. So thank you, Jeffrey Sachs. Would you all please thank Jeffrey Sachs for this evening?
Yeah. That's so nice. Thank you.